Number 1. This 1937 Ford 5-window coupe, currently listed at $48,500 in St. John's, Florida, is a fully rebuilt street rod that blends one of Ford's most recognizable pre-war coupe designs with a thoroughly modernized chassis, updated driveline, and comfort-oriented features that make it feel far more usable than a stock 1930s car. According to the seller, the car has been completely redone and sits on a new TCI frame, which is a major part of what makes this build stand out. In my opinion, that matters because a quality aftermarket chassis can dramatically improve how a classic car drives, handles, and feels on the road, rather than simply restoring an old body and leaving the rest mostly original. This Ford appears to have been built with the goal of creating a dependable, road-friendly cruiser from the ground up. Power comes from a 350 cubic inch V8 paired with a turbo 350 automatic transmission, along with a Ford 8-inch rear and carrying 3.00 gears. That is a very familiar street rod formula, and honestly, there's a reason it remains popular. The small block Chevy and TH350 combination is known for reliability, easy serviceability, and strong aftermarket support, while the taller rear gearing should help the car feel more relaxed at cruising speeds. It may not be an exotic drivetrain setup, but for someone who wants a classic that can be driven regularly without drama, it makes a lot of sense. The seller also notes that the car has received all new wiring, glass, gauges, and additional upgrades such as power steering, power brakes, electric windows, and an audio system. To me, those details push this Ford more into the usable restamod category rather than a stripped-down traditional hot rod. It sounds like the builder wanted to preserve the look of a 1937 Ford coupe while giving it the conveniences and drivability that make it enjoyable in modern traffic. Visually, a black 1937 Ford coupe with a red interior is already a strong combination. The 1937 model year has always had a distinctive look thanks to its rounded fenders, sloping grille, and compact proportions, and in my opinion, it is one of the most attractive Ford coupes of the late pre-war era. That body style works especially well as a street rod because it has enough presence to stand out a show, but it is still compact and sporty enough to feel like a real driver's car. What I find most appealing about this listing is that it seems to offer a middle ground between a high-dollar show build and a rough project. It is not presented as a radical race-oriented machine, but it also is not a tired old original that needs constant work. Instead, it sounds like a finished, sorted coupe with the right upgrades in the right places, good chassis, proven drivetrain, modern power accessories, and fresh supporting components. At $48,500, this 1937 Ford 5-window coupe is priced like a serious, completed street rod rather than an entry-level project, but based on the seller's description, it appears to bring the kind of build quality and usability that many buyers are looking for. For someone who wants a classic pre-war Ford with timeless styling, V8 power, and the comfort to actually get out and drive it, this looks like a very appealing package.
Number 2. In my opinion, this 1947 Ford Deluxe Coupe Custom, currently listed at $10,500 in Camp Hill, Pennsylvania, is an affordable post-war custom that blends classic Ford styling with a more powerful Chevrolet V8 swap and a handful of useful mechanical updates. It does not sound like a freshly finished show car, but rather an older restoration and driver-quality cruiser that still offers plenty of charm for someone who wants a vintage coupe they can enjoy without spending top-tier money. According to the seller, the car is powered by a 355 Chevrolet engine and retains a 3-on-the-tree manual transmission, while the suspension and driveline remain original 1947 Ford components. That combination makes this car a bit more unusual than the typical automatic swap street rod, because it keeps more of the original Ford driving feel while still benefiting from the added power of a small block Chevy. In my view, that gives the car an interesting personality. It is not fully stock, but it also has not been transformed so heavily that it loses all connection to its original character. One of the strongest points in the listing is the amount of recent work that has already been completed. The seller notes a new starter, new clutch, new bell housing, and a complete rewiring of the car, which are all meaningful improvements on a vintage custom like this. The radiator has also been re-cored, which is another valuable detail because cooling can often be a weak point on older swapped classics. To me, those upgrades suggest the car has received practical attention where it matters most: starting, drivability, and basic reliability. At the same time, the listing is refreshingly honest about what the car still needs. The seller mentions that it will eventually require new tires along with window and trunk seals, and that the paint and body show normal wear from an older restoration. I actually see that transparency as a positive, because it helps position the Ford as what it really is, a usable driver and ongoing hobby car rather than something being oversold as flawless. For many buyers in this price range, that kind of honesty is far more valuable than exaggerated claims. From a styling standpoint, the 1947 Ford Deluxe Coupe remains a very attractive post-war body style, with its rounded fenders, long hood, and unmistakable late 1940s profile. Finished in burgundy, this one likely still has plenty of visual presence even if the paint is no longer fresh. The fact that it includes a car cover is a small bonus, but it also hints that the current owner has at least taken steps to protect it. Overall, I believe this 1947 Ford Deluxe Coupe Custom is best viewed as a budget-friendly V8 swapped classic that already has several important mechanical jobs completed and still retains much of its old-school Ford personality. It may need a few finishing touches and cosmetic acceptance, but for someone looking for an affordable custom coupe with manual transmission, classic styling, and solid cruising potential, I think it offers a lot of appeal for the money.
Number 3. This 1944 Tudor sedan, currently listed at $11,500 in Jefferson, Georgia, is the kind of old-school Ford that feels more like a real piece of Southern driving history than just another vintage car for sale. According to the seller, it is powered by a flathead V8 paired with a manual transmission. And while that alone is enough to get the attention of many traditional Ford enthusiasts, what really makes this car stand out is the way it seems to balance authenticity, usability, and personality all in one package. The seller describes it as a great-running, solid car with a long list of recent work already completed. That includes a new fuel system, new brakes, dual exhaust, new tires, updated seat upholstery, a 12-volt charging system, HEI ignition and coil, and new 12-volt lights. In my opinion, those upgrades make a huge difference because they suggest this Tudor is not just a nostalgic old body sitting on worn-out mechanicals, but a classic that has actually been sorted to be driven and enjoyed with fewer headaches. For a flathead Ford, having those kinds of reliability-focused updates already done can be a major advantage. What I like most about this listing is that it does not sound over-restored or sanitized. Quite the opposite, actually. The seller mentions that the car has a few whiskey dings and a nice patina, and personally, I think that adds a lot to the appeal. Cars like this can lose some of their soul when they're restored too perfectly. A little wear, some honest age, and a body that still tells part of its story often make a car feel much more authentic, especially when the seller is leaning into its identity as a true moonshine hauler with North Georgia history. That moonshine hauler description is probably the most memorable part of the whole listing, and honestly, it gives this Ford a personality that a lot of restored classics simply do not have. Whether or not every part of that history can be documented, it still paints a vivid picture of what this car represents. A tough old Ford sedan from the hills of Georgia, powered by a flathead, wearing its years proudly, and still drawing attention every time it hits the road. In my view, that kind of backstory matters because buyers are not always just buying sheet metal and mechanical parts. They're buying a vibe, an era, and a story they want to be part of. Another important detail is the seller's emphasis on reliability. They specifically describe the setup as very reliable and say it gets a lot of attention on the road. That combination is really the sweet spot for a car like this. It is one thing for an old Ford to look cool sitting still, but it is another thing entirely for it to be dependable enough that you can actually take it out regularly, enjoy the sound of the flathead and dual exhaust, and not feel like every drive is a gamble. At $11,500, this Ford also feels relatively accessible compared to many early hot rods and traditional flathead era cars that have either been fully restored into much higher price brackets or are still rough projects needing everything. This one sounds like it lives somewhere in the middle. Not perfect, not pristine, but solid, sorted, and full of character. To me, that could be a very appealing place to be, especially for someone who wants a vintage Ford that still feels raw and honest instead of polished to the point of losing its identity. Overall, if the seller's description accurately reflects the car's condition, this 1944 Tudor sedan seems like a very cool Very authentic driver-grade classic with real personality. In my opinion, the biggest selling point here is not just the flathead V8 or the recent mechanical work, but the fact that it sounds like a car with history, attitude, and enough reliability to be enjoyed the way an old Ford should be, on the road, making noise, and turning heads wherever it goes. Number 4. This 1937 Ford 3-window coupe, currently listed at $59,995 in Waxhaw, North Carolina, is a classic American hot rod that takes one of Ford's most desirable pre-war body styles and pairs it with a proven small-block Chevy drivetrain. With just 7,000 miles showing, a clean title, and only 2 reported owners, this coupe appears to be positioned as a finished custom rather than an unfinished project or rough driver. According to the listing, the car is powered by a 350 cubic inch Chevrolet V8, which is one of the most common and trusted engine choices in the street rod world. In my opinion, that's actually a strong point for a car like this, because a 350 Chevy offers a combination of reliability, easy parts availability, and enough performance to make a lightweight coupe like this genuinely fun to drive, without becoming overly complicated to maintain. It may not be the most exotic setup, but it's hard to argue with it in terms of practicality and long-term ownership. What really gives this car its appeal, though, is the body style itself. The 1937 Ford 3-window coupe has always had a strong presence in the hot rod community because it combines the elegance of late 1930s Ford styling with a compact, sporty coupe profile that naturally lends itself to custom builds. Personally, I think that's a big part of why cars like this continue to command attention even in a crowded classic car market. It has the kind of shape that looks good whether it's restored, mildly modified, or fully customized. The bright orange exterior and matching orange interior make this particular example sound especially bold. That kind of monochromatic color scheme is definitely not subtle, but in my view, it fits the personality of a street rod. A car like this isn't supposed to disappear into the background. It's supposed to stand out at cruise nights, local shows, and weekend gatherings, and a color combination like this certainly helps it do that. Because the listing is brief, there's still a lot of details a buyer would want to confirm, especially regarding suspension, brakes, interior finish quality, and whether the mileage reflects time since the build was completed. Still, based on what is provided, this doesn't sound like a bare-bones project. It sounds more like a completed hot rod built to be enjoyed, with the classic formula of a lightweight Ford coupe body and dependable Chevy V8 power. Overall, if the build quality matches the asking price, this 1937 Ford 3-window coupe looks like an attractive traditional street rod that offers strong visual presence, proven V8 performance, and one of the most iconic pre-war Ford body styles ever made. For someone who wants a recognizable hot rod with classic looks and a straightforward drivetrain, this one sounds like a very appealing package. Number 5. This 1937 Chevrolet Classic Coupe, currently listed at $53,000 in Calhoun, Georgia, appears to be a custom-built street rod or show-style cruiser rather than a factory-original pre-war Chevrolet, although the listing itself leaves out most of the technical details that would normally help define exactly what kind of build it is. In my opinion, this is one of those listings where the price and presentation tell you more than the written description does. The seller calls it a super slick coupe, gives it a fairly serious asking price of $53,000, and pairs that with a red exterior, black interior, and automatic transmission. To me, that strongly suggests this is not a rough project or lightly modified old car, but a finished custom or restored vehicle with a visual presence strong enough to justify being marketed more on appearance than on specs. What makes this one a little tricky is that the listing doesn't provide the kind of details that usually matter most in the street rod world. There's no mention of the engine, transmission type, suspension setup, brake upgrades, interior modifications, or whether the body is steel or fiberglass. So unlike some of the other cars in your list where the mechanical package tells the whole story, this one has to be judged more by what's implied than what's confirmed. That said, in my opinion, the $53,000 asking price is the biggest clue here. Sellers generally don't put that kind of number on a 1937 Chevrolet unless the car is already built to a fairly high standard, whether that means a polished street rod, a professionally restored coupe, or a high-end custom with show car presentation. Combined with the super slick coupe description, I'd read this as a car that likely has strong cosmetic appeal and probably a modernized drivetrain underneath, even if the seller didn't bother listing the details. The 1937 Chevrolet coupe body itself is a strong platform to begin with. It has that classic late 1930s shape with rounded fenders, a long hood, and proportions that work equally well as a stock restoration, a traditional hot rod, or a full custom street rod. In my view, that body style has enough visual presence on its own that if it's finished in bright red with a black interior and sitting right, it can absolutely command attention at local shows or cruise nights. At the same time, I'd say this is also the kind of listing where a buyer would need to ask a lot of questions before taking the price at face value. If I were evaluating it seriously, I want to know what engine it has, whether the chassis is original or upgraded, if it has air conditioning, power steering, disc brakes, and how old the build actually is. Those details are what separate a $30,000 driver from a $50,000 plus professionally finished car. Overall, I think this 1937 Chevrolet Classic should be viewed as a high-priced custom or restored coupe with a lot of missing information in the listing itself. The look, the asking price, and the seller's wording all point toward a finished and likely eye-catching build. But without the full spec sheet, it's hard to judge whether the price reflects true craftsmanship, major mechanical upgrades, or simply a polished presentation. So from my perspective, this is a car that could be very impressive, but it's also one where the next step would absolutely be getting the full details before deciding how strong the value really is. Number 6. This 1951 Ford Deluxe Club Coupe, currently listed at $12,000 in Ringgold, Virginia, is an appealing Survivor-era flathead Ford that seems to offer a rare combination of originality, honest upkeep, and usable mechanical upgrades without losing the character that makes early 1950s Ford so enjoyable in the first place. According to the seller, this car is powered by its original-style flathead V8 paired with a 3-speed manual transmission mounted on the column. The classic 3-on-the-tree setup that defined the driving experience of so many American cars from this period. In my opinion, that alone gives this Ford a lot of charm, because a car like this is not about raw performance or flashy customization. It is about preserving the feeling of a genuine early post-war American coupe, while still making it practical enough to drive and enjoy today. The seller also notes a long list of recent maintenance and upgrades, including new tires, ignition components such as the cap, rotor, points, and condenser, along with fresh sending units and cooling-related work. On top of that, the car now wears Offenhauser heads, which is a particularly interesting detail because that is the kind of period speed equipment many flathead enthusiasts actively look for. The fact that the original heads are included makes it even better in my view, because it gives the next owner the flexibility to either keep the mild performance upgrade in place or return the car closer to stock if originality becomes the priority. There are also a few thoughtful usability improvements that make this Ford sound more attractive as a real driver. The seller mentions an aluminum radiator, updated front coil springs sourced from a Ford Aerostar, and additional replaced sending units, all of which suggest that this has not simply been sitting and aging untouched. Instead, it sounds like a car that has been kept mechanically alive and improved where it made sense, but without crossing over into full rest-a-mod territory. To me, that is often the sweet spot with Survivor-style classics. What makes this listing especially interesting is the seller's description of the car as an awesome Survivor with an all-original interior and no rust. That is a big claim on any 1951 Ford, and if accurate, it adds a lot of appeal. The seller is upfront that the paint is older and not especially good, having been redone in the 1990s, so cosmetically this does not sound like a show car. But honestly, I think that works in its favor. A car like this feels more honest when it shows some age on the outside, but still delivers solid bones, original cabin character, and a drivetrain that runs and drives well. Personally, I think the value of this Ford lies in the fact that it does not seem over-restored, over-modified, or overly precious. It sounds like the kind of car you could take to a local cruise night, park with the hood up, talk flatheads with people, and then drive home without worrying about every little imperfection. The Club Coupe body style also helps because it has a sleeker, sportier profile than a four-door sedan, while still keeping the practical, substantial feel of a real early 1950s Ford. At $12,000, this 1951 Ford looks like a very interesting option for someone who wants an affordable entry into vintage flathead ownership without jumping straight into a full project car. If the body is truly rust-free, the interior is as original as claimed, and it really does run and drive as well as the seller says, then this feels like one of those classics that offers more personality than polish. And sometimes that is exactly what makes a car worth owning. Number 7. In my opinion, this 1952 Plymouth Cranbrook is one of those classic American convertibles that feels more appealing as a dependable vintage cruiser than as a high-end collector's showpiece. Listed at $17,000 in Palatka, Florida, it seems to offer the kind of honest, usable classic car experience that many buyers actually want. Something stylish, distinctive, and road-ready, without the pressure of owning a museum-level restoration. What makes this Plymouth especially interesting to me is the fact that it appears to be a convertible, and the seller specifically notes that the power top is working properly. On a car from the early 1950s, that is a very meaningful detail, because top mechanisms can often be one of the more troublesome and expensive things to sort out. The fact that the top works as it should adds a lot to the car's enjoyment factor, especially if the next owner wants to use it for weekend cruising, local shows, or just relaxed sunny day driving. The seller also describes the car as very dependable, driving well, and being in working order throughout. In my view, those are exactly the qualities that matter most in a car like this. A 1952 Plymouth is not a performance car, and is not likely being purchased for investment-grade Concours competition. Its real appeal is in its character, its style, and the experience of owning a genuine early 1950s American convertible that can still be driven and enjoyed regularly. Visually, the yellow exterior paired with a yellow interior suggests that this car probably has a very cheerful and period-correct personality. Plymouth's Cranbrook models already have a lot of post-war charm, thanks to their rounded lines, simple chrome trim, and balanced proportions, and a bright color combination only adds to that nostalgic appeal. I can easily imagine this being the kind of car that stands out at a local cruise and not because it is the most expensive vehicle there, but because it has a fun, approachable, and unmistakably vintage presence. The listing itself is fairly brief, so there's still a lot of details that would need to be verified in person, especially regarding the quality of the paint, the condition of the underbody, and whether the drivetrain is original or has been rebuilt. But based on the seller's description, this does not sound like a neglected project or a non-running restoration case. Instead, it sounds like a classic that has been kept operational and enjoyed, which in many ways is exactly what a car like this should be. Overall, I believe this 1952 Plymouth Cranbrook's biggest strength is that it seems to offer simple, open-top classic motoring in a package that is already described as dependable and functional. It may not be the flashiest or most valuable classic on the market, but for someone who wants an early 1950s convertible with vintage charm, working top operation, and driver quality usability, I think it has a lot going for it at the asking price. Number 8. This 1940 Plymouth P10 Coupe, currently listed at $25,000 in Pleasant Garden, North Carolina, is a restored and updated pre-war Mopar that appears to blend classic styling with a much more serious performance personality than the original car ever had from the factory. According to the seller, the coupe has been fitted with a 340 V8, making it more of a custom cruiser or mild street rod than a stock restoration. And from the description alone, it sounds like the kind of car that was built to be driven, shown, and enjoyed rather than hidden away. What immediately stands out to me is the engine choice. A 340 V8 in a 1940 Plymouth completely changes the character of the car. Instead of a slow, purely nostalgic pre-war coupe, you suddenly have something with real Mopar performance DNA under the hood. In my opinion, that is a big part of what makes this listing interesting, because it keeps the old-school shape and charm of the Plymouth while giving it the kind of power that makes it more exciting in modern traffic. The seller also mentions that the car has air conditioning, which adds another layer of usability and makes it easier to enjoy during warm weather cruising or summer shows. The black exterior with a red interior sounds like a very strong combination for a car like this. Even without seeing it in person, it is easy to imagine this Plymouth having a lot of presence. Cars for 1940 already have a naturally dramatic shape, with rounded fenders, a long hood, and that compact coupe roofline. And when you pair that with black paint and a red interior, it creates the kind of visual contrast that tends to draw attention immediately. The seller even calls it a great head turner. And honestly, that part sounds believable. What I appreciate most about this listing, though, is that it does not pretend to be flawless. The seller is upfront about the fact that the car still needs suspension bushings and a few small tune-up items, and they also mention a few paint imperfections and some intermittent minor leaks. Personally, I always like when sellers present a classic car honestly rather than trying to oversell as perfect. In this case, it actually makes the car sound more authentic and more like a real driver. The fact that the seller says they have been driving it locally despite those small needs tells me this is not some unfinished garage ornament. It is a usable classic that still has room for the next owner to fine-tune it. Another detail I find encouraging is that the car reportedly spent more than 10 years in the previous owner's collection and has been garage stored. While the seller does not know the full restoration history, long-term collector ownership often suggests the car was at least cared for and preserved rather than neglected. It is also a good sign that the seller is willing to put the car on a lift for a serious buyer. That kind of openness usually helps build confidence, especially with a custom vintage car where the underbody, suspension, and quality of the workmanship matter just as much as the paint and interior. In my view, this Plymouth sits in a pretty appealing category. It is not a pure original restoration for someone chasing factory authenticity, but also does not sound like an over-the-top show-only build that is too radical to use. Instead, it feels like a stylish Mopar-powered custom that still has a few imperfections, a few needs, and a lot of personality. Sometimes that can be the sweet spot because it means you're getting a car with presence and performance without being afraid to actually drive it. Overall, if the seller's description accurately reflects the car's condition, this 1940 Plymouth P10 Coupe seems like a very cool and distinctive vintage Mopar cruiser with real street rod flavor. In my opinion, its biggest strength is the combination of classic pre-war styling, a strong 340 V8 upgrade, and an honest driver quality presentation that makes it feel approachable, usable, and genuinely fun rather than overly polished or disconnected from the road. Number 9. This 1935 Ford Model 48 Deluxe Phaeton, currently listed at $32,990 in Merrick, New York, is a remarkably original pre-war Ford that offers something increasingly difficult to find in today's collector market: an unmodified, largely untouched example of one of Ford's most elegant open-top body styles from the mid-1930s. Finished in Washington blue with a brown interior, this Phaeton seems to be aimed less at the hot rod crowd and more at the buyer who appreciates authenticity, preservation, and the kind of character that only an honest old car can carry. According to the seller, this Ford remains largely original, including its 221 cubic inch flathead V8, original convertible top, and original leather interior. That immediately makes it stand out to me, because so many 1930s Ford have been customized, street rod, or heavily restored over the years. In my opinion, one of the biggest strengths of this car is that it has apparently avoided all of that. It sounds like the kind of survivor that still tells its own story, rather than one that has been rewritten by later modifications. The seller notes that the car has had one repaint in Ford Washington blue, which feels like a very appropriate choice because it keeps the car visually rooted in its original era rather than trying to modernize it. Personally, I think that matters with a car like this. A 1935 Phaeton is already a special body style, and preserving the period-correct look does a lot to protect its charm. The brown leather interior and original convertible top likely add even more to that sense of authenticity, especially for buyers who value originality over perfection. Mechanically, it still uses the original 221 cubic inch flathead V8 rated at 85 horsepower, and the seller says it starts easily, runs at around 190 degrees, and has recently had its oil changed. That may not sound dramatic by modern standards, but for a 91-year-old car, those are encouraging signs. The seller also mentions several recent maintenance items, including a new gas tank, electric fuel gauge and sender, new temperature gauge, new tie rod ends, a replacement NOS horn/headlight switch and rod, and a new stoplight switch. To me, that suggests the car hasn't just been sitting as a static display piece. It sounds like it has been maintained thoughtfully enough to remain usable and enjoyable. Another detail I like is that this is a deluxe model, which means it includes extras such as dual horns, dual taillights, and additional chrome trim. Those features may seem minor on paper, but on a pre-war Ford they contribute a lot to the visual personality of the car. They help elevate it from a basic old convertible into something that feels more upscale and complete. The only real deviation from factory specification appears to be the conversion to dual exhaust, but even that doesn't sound like a deal breaker because the seller is including the original style exhaust manifolds, gaskets, and hangers to make it easier to return the car to a single exhaust setup if the next owner wants a more factory-correct presentation. In my view, that flexibility is a plus because it gives the buyer a choice without forcing them to hunt down hard-to-find parts later. Overall, if the condition is as honest as the description suggests, this 1935 Ford Model 48 Deluxe Sedan looks like a very appealing collector car for someone who values originality, period-correct character, and the unmistakable charm of a real pre-war Ford. It may not be the fastest or flashiest car in the group, but in terms of authenticity and historical presence, I think it has a lot going for it. Number 10. This 1948 Ford Crown Victoria, listed in Glasgow, Kentucky, is actually described more like a radically customized 1948 Ford Anglia-style/Anglia-inspired hot rod build rather than a factory Crown Victoria. And in my opinion, it sounds like one of the wildest full custom cars in this batch. With an asking price of $40,000, this is clearly not being presented as a restored vintage Ford, but as a one-off custom showing cruise machine built around dramatic body modifications, V8 power, and a very aggressive street rod personality. What immediately stands out to me is just how extreme the bodywork appears to be. According to the seller, the car has been chopped 7.5 inches and stretched 13.5 inches, which tells me this is far beyond a mild custom. Those are serious structural modifications that completely change the proportions of the original body and push the car into true hand-built custom territory. In my view, when a builder goes that far with a roofline and wheelbase, the result is usually aimed at maximum visual impact rather than originality. And that seems to be exactly the point here. Mechanically, the car is powered by a 350 Chevrolet V8 with an automatic transmission and a Ford 9-inch rear end, which is a very common and proven combination in the hot rod world. Personally, I think that's a smart choice for a car like this because once you've already committed to a radical custom build, using a dependable small block Chevy and a strong rear axle makes it much easier to maintain and enjoy than trying to preserve some obscure original drivetrain. It may not be brand pure, but it absolutely fits the spirit of a one-off custom rod. The seller also mentions a roll cage, which is an interesting detail because it suggests this build may have been designed with more than just appearance in mind. Whether it was added for safety, chassis rigidity, or to support the chopped body structure, it gives the impression that this wasn't just a cosmetic custom thrown together for photos. It sounds like a serious build with real fabrication behind it. Inside, the car reportedly features power windows, a custom interior, dolphin gauges, and racing seats, which in my opinion reinforces the idea that this Ford is meant to feel more like a custom performance rod than a traditional late 1940s cruiser. Racing seats and custom gauges tend to give a build a more aggressive, almost pro-street flavor, while the power windows add a level of convenience you wouldn't expect in something this radical. The burgundy exterior paired with a black interior also sounds like a good match for the overall attitude of the car. Add in the seller's note about custom paint and too much to list, and it's pretty clear this is a build where the visual presentation is a huge part of the appeal. It's the kind of car that's supposed to stop people in their tracks at a local cruise night or indoor show, not blend into a lineup of stock restorations. That said, I do think this is also one of those listings where the buyer needs to separate custom value from collector value. A car like this can be spectacular if you love the builder's taste, proportions, and execution, but because it's so heavily modified, it's never going to appeal to the same audience as a factory-correct Ford coupe or sedan. In other words, The value here depends almost entirely on the quality of the workmanship and whether the next buyer connects with the style of the build. Overall, I think this 1948 Ford Custom is best viewed as a high-effort, one-off radical hot rod rather than a traditional classic. It has major body modifications, dependable V8/automatic setup, custom interior work, and the kind of visual drama that makes it memorable. If the craftsmanship is as strong in person as the seller suggests, then this could be a very compelling car for someone who wants a unique custom that no one else at the show will have. But it's definitely a personality car, and the right buyer will need to appreciate just how far from stock it really is. Number 11. This 1939 Ford Coupe Standard, currently listed at $46,000 in Louisville, Kentucky, is a fully restored pre-war Ford street rod that blends the unmistakable shape of a late 1930s coupe with a well-rounded mix of small block Chevrolet power, comfort upgrades, and long-distance cruising features. According to the seller, this Ford has undergone a frame-off restoration and is described as rust-free, which is a major selling point on any car from this era. Under the hood is a Chevrolet small block that started as a 350 and was bored .030 over to 355 cubic inches, then professionally built by Porter's Machine Shop and fitted with aluminum heads. The seller states that the engine has only around 1,100 miles since the build, which suggests that the drivetrain is still relatively fresh and likely has seen limited use since completion. In my opinion, what makes this coupe interesting is that it does not sound like a stripped-down old-school hot rod, but rather a street rod built to be genuinely comfortable and usable. The drivetrain is paired with a turbo 350 automatic transmission, while the chassis has been upgraded with front disc brakes and power steering. That combination should make the car much easier to enjoy in modern traffic than an original 1939 Ford, especially for someone who wants to drive it regularly instead of just trailering it to shows. The comfort side of the build is where this car really starts to separate itself from more basic street rods. The seller notes that it has vintage air and even mentions recently spending an additional $1,200 on air conditioning parts and labor, which suggests the system has been sorted rather than simply installed years ago and forgotten. It also comes with 6-way power seats, a stereo, CB radio, a GM tilt steering column, and a GM wiring harness. To me, that sounds like a build aimed at making the car feel easy to live with, not just visually impressive. The car also appears to have received a number of practical supporting upgrades, including a new aluminum radiator with a temperature-controlled electric fan and shroud, along with new artillery wheels and tires. Those are the kinds of details that may not sound flashy in a listing, but they matter if the goal is to own a classic that can sit in traffic, cruise comfortably, and start every time without drama. Personally, I think the 1939 Ford Coupe is one of the best-looking Ford body styles of the pre-war era because it has a more refined, streamlined profile than the earlier 1930s cars, while still keeping the proportions and personality that make old Ford so appealing. In red with a tan interior, this one sounds like it was built to be both eye-catching and road trip friendly, which is a combination a lot of buyers are after. At $46,000, this is not an entry-level project or a rough weekend toy. It reads more like a completed, comfort-oriented street rod for someone who wants the classic Ford look without sacrificing drivability. If the restoration quality is as strong as the seller suggests and the rust-free claim checks out, I think this 1939 Ford could appeal to a buyer who wants a pre-war coupe that is just as happy a local cruise in as it is covering highway miles with the air conditioning on. Number 12. In my opinion, this 1946 Ford Deluxe two-door sedan, currently listed at $26,500 in Brookville, Ohio, is a well-rounded post-war street rod that seems to have been built with one main goal in mind, making a classic-looking Ford genuinely enjoyable to drive in the modern world. Rather than focusing on strict originality, this build appears to lean into usability, comfort, and dependable V8 performance, while still preserving the unmistakable look of a late 1940s Ford sedan. According to the seller, the car is powered by a 350 V8 paired with an automatic transmission, and it also features a Holley carburetor, Locher shifter, and Walker radiator. In my view, that is a very proven combination for a car like this. The The small block Chevy and automatic transmission setup has been a staple in the street rod world for decades because it offers easy parts availability, straightforward maintenance, and the kind of reliable cruising performance that makes an older custom much less intimidating to own. It may not be original to the car, but it absolutely makes sense for someone who wants to drive rather than constantly tinker. What makes this Ford more appealing than a basic engine swap classic is the number of supporting upgrades already built into it. The seller mentions air conditioning, a tilt steering column, a Mustang 2 front suspension with rack and pinion steering and disc brakes, plus a Ford 9-inch rear end. To me, those are the details that really define the personality of the build. This is not just an old sedan with a V8 dropped into it. It sounds like a car that has been thoughtfully updated in all the areas that matter most for modern drivability. The Mustang 2 front end should improve steering response and ride quality, while front disc brakes and the 9-inch rear help make the car feel much more capable and confidence-inspiring than a stock 1946 Ford would. The seller also notes that the car has new tires and wheels, along with nice paint and interior, and describes it as running and driving well. That combination is important because it suggests the car is not simply mechanically upgraded, but also finished to a level where it can be enjoyed immediately as a complete package. In my opinion, that makes it more attractive to buyers who are not looking for another long-term project, but instead want a turnkey cruiser they can take to local shows, weekend events, or just out for a relaxed evening drive. Visually, a silver exterior with a gray interior gives this Ford a somewhat cleaner and more understated look than the brighter colors often seen on traditional hot rods. That works in its favor. The 1946 Ford sedan already has plenty of presence thanks to its rounded post-war body lines and classic two-door proportions, so a more subdued color combination can actually make the overall build feel a bit more mature and refined. Overall, I believe this 1946 Ford Deluxe sedan looks like a strong example of a driver-focused street rod that was built to be used, not just admired from a distance. With V8 power, automatic transmission, air conditioning, upgraded suspension and brakes, and a reportedly nice overall presentation, it seems to offer the kind of classic car ownership experience that many enthusiasts are really after. Vintage style with far fewer vintage compromises. Number 13. This 1940 Ford sedan, currently listed at $22,500 in Calhoun, Tennessee, looks like a very appealing example of a traditional flathead-era Ford that has been updated in all the right places without losing the personality that makes these cars special in the first place. According to the seller, the car is powered by a V8 flathead engine backed by a manual transmission, and it has received a long list of recent upgrades aimed at making it more reliable, safer, and easier to enjoy on modern roads. What stands out right away is that this does not sound like a neglected old Ford that still needs everything. In fact, the seller lists a substantial amount of recent work, including a new gas tank, electric fuel pump, wiring, braking system, wheels and tires, shocks, and a 12-volt battery, along with a rebuilt 12-volt alternator and starter. In my opinion, that is exactly the kind of money and effort that matters most on a driver-grade classic. Cosmetic restoration is one thing, but when someone has already gone through the fuel, electrical, and brake systems, that usually makes a huge difference in how dependable the car actually feels once you start using it regularly. The flathead V8 is obviously a major part of the appeal here. These engines are not about big horsepower numbers or modern performance, but they deliver something arguably more important in a car like this: character. A 1940 Ford with a flathead and a manual transmission offers the kind of old-school driving experience that feels completely different from anything modern. Personally, I think that is a big reason why these cars still have such a loyal following. They are not just transportation. They are rolling pieces of American automotive culture, and the sound, feel, and look of a flathead Ford is a huge part of that identity. Another thing I like about this listing is the way it seems to combine vintage charm with practical upgrades. The 12-volt conversion, rebuilt alternator and starter, and electric fuel pump are all smart improvements if the goal is to make the car easier to live with. LED tail lights are another sensible addition because they improve visibility and safety without dramatically changing the car's appearance. To me, That kind of approach usually makes for a better real-world classic, something you can enjoy often without constantly worrying about the weak points that come with 1940s electrical systems and fuel delivery. The seller also says the interior looks great and describes the car as something you can drive anywhere in comfort. That is a bold claim for an 86-year-old sedan, but if accurate, it makes the car significantly more attractive. One of the biggest differences between a fun classic and a frustrating one is whether it actually feels sorted enough to go out and use. A flathead Ford that looks good is nice, but a flathead Ford that starts easily, stops properly, rides well, and can be driven confidently for more than just a few local miles is on a different level. Visually, a black 1940 Ford sedan with a gray interior is also a very strong combination. The 1940 Ford body is one of the most recognizable and best-looking shapes of the era, with its smooth front end, rounded fenders, and unmistakable pre-war proportions. In my opinion, black suits these cars especially well because it emphasizes the curves and gives the whole car a more serious, timeless presence. Overall, if the seller's description accurately reflects the car's condition, this 1940 Ford sedan seems like a very solid and usable traditional Ford the Fifth 8-driver with a lot going for it. In my view, the biggest value here is not just the car's styling or flathead engine, but the fact that so many of the right mechanical and electrical updates have already been handled. That makes it feel less like a risky old project and more like a classic you could buy, enjoy, and actually put some miles on without losing the vintage experience that makes these early Fords so appealing. Number 14. This 1939 Ford two-door sedan, currently listed at $22,000 in Corydon, Tennessee, is a thoroughly upgraded street rod that blends pre-war Ford styling with a long list of modern mechanical and comfort improvements. Built around an all-steel body and restored from what the seller describes as a very solid original foundation, this looks like the kind of car that was assembled to be driven regularly rather than just parked at shows. According to the seller, the car is powered by a Chevrolet 350 small block V8 backed by a turbo 353-speed automatic transmission. In my opinion, that's a practical and proven combination for a custom like this because it offers dependable performance, easy parts availability, and straightforward maintenance without adding unnecessary complexity. It's the kind of setup that makes an older custom much easier to live with, especially if the next owner actually wants to put miles on it. What really stands out to me, though, is how extensively the chassis and driving systems have been upgraded. The seller says the car has a Nova front clip with coil springs, Fatman A-arms, lowered spindles, a Chevy 10-bolt rear end, front disc brakes, and rear drums. That tells me this isn't just a basic engine swap. It sounds more like a full street rod build aimed at improving ride quality, handling, and overall road manners. For a late 1930s sedan, that kind of suspension work can completely transform the driving experience compared to stock. The comfort features are also a big part of the appeal here. Vintage heat and air, power steering, dual wipers, a tilt wheel, AM/FM audio, a 6-way power seat, seat belts front and rear, and even a backup camera make this Ford feel much more usable in modern traffic than most pre-war cars. Personally, I think that's one of the strongest selling points of the build. A lot of classic customs look good in photos, but still feel old and inconvenient behind the wheel. This one sounds like it was built with real-world drivability in mind. Visually, the two-tone candy purple exterior is obviously a bold choice, and it gives the car a much more custom personality than a traditional restoration would. That kind of color won't appeal to everyone, but in my view, it fits the spirit of a street rod. It turns the car into more of a statement piece. And when paired with the gray cloth interior and centerline wheels, it sounds like it leans confidently into its custom identity rather than trying to hide it. Another thing I like about this listing is the seller's emphasis on the car being roadworthy, dependable, and well-maintained. Those are the words I'd want to hear with a custom-built pre-war sedan, because once a car has been modified this extensively, the quality of the build and the care it's received matter just as much as the parts list itself. Overall, if the workmanship matches the description, this 1939 Ford two-door sedan appears to be a well-rounded and very usable street rod with a solid all-steel body, proven small-block Chevy power, substantial suspension upgrades, and a long list of comfort features. For someone who wants a pre-war Ford with custom looks and modern drivability at a relatively accessible price, this one sounds like a strong value. Number 15. This 1949 Plymouth Special Deluxe, currently listed at $1,000 in Montrose, Virginia, is a low-cost post-war American sedan project that offers a surprising amount of originality, documentation, and personality for the money, even though it still needs real restoration work before it can be considered road-ready. In my opinion, what makes this car stand out is that it doesn't feel like a random, abandoned shell. It feels like an honest, old survivor with a story behind it. The seller even gives it a name, Clyde, and describes it as an awesome example of American history, which might sound sentimental, but after reading the details, I can see why. This Plymouth seems to have stayed unusually complete, and for a $1,000 project car, that alone makes it more interesting than a lot of stripped-down or half-missing restorations. Mechanically, it still carries its 218 cubic inch inline-six and 3-speed manual transmission, which is exactly the kind of drivetrain you'd want to see if the goal is to preserve the car's original character. No, it's not fast and it's not exotic, but that's not really the point. In my view, the charm of a late 1940s Plymouth like this is in its simplicity. The slow, durable, flathead-style 6-cylinder experience, the column shift manual, and the kind of driving feel that belongs to a completely different era of American motoring. The seller hasn't actually had the car running yet, so I wouldn't describe it as a driver by any stretch, but there are a few encouraging signs. They mention that the clutch works, the car rolls, and the brakes function, even if the linkage needs lubrication. That tells me the car isn't completely frozen in place, which is often one of the first big hurdles on a long-stored project. The fact that the engine hasn't been condemned either is also notable. The seller says they have no reason to believe it wouldn't run, which isn't a guarantee of anything, but it does suggest the drivetrain may still be a viable candidate for revival rather than immediate replacement. Where this Plymouth gets more appealing, in my opinion, is in the smaller details. The original wheels have already been sandblasted and powder-coated, the oil bath air cleaner has been restored, and the original spare tire is still in the trunk. Those are the kinds of details that tell me someone actually cared about the car and intended to move the project forward, even if life got in the way. Add to that the fact that it comes with inspection receipts dating back to 1949, and suddenly this isn't just a cheap old sedan, it's a car with real paper history and continuity, which is something collectors genuinely value. The biggest downside is structural. The floor needs to be replaced. That's not a small repair, and I think it's important to be realistic about that. Floor replacement means welding, fabrication, and real labor, not just a tune-up and fresh gas. The good news is that the seller specifically mentions replacement panels are available, which at least makes the job more feasible than it would be on an orphan car with no reproduction support. Overall, I think this 1949 Plymouth Special Deluxe makes the most sense as a budget restoration project for someone who appreciates originality and doesn't mind metal work. At $1,000, you're not buying a turnkey classic. You're buying a complete old sedan with a working manual drivetrain layout, period documentation, and enough charm to justify saving it. If someone wants a cheap entry into post-war Mopar ownership and is willing to put in the effort, Clyde actually feels like one of those projects that could be very satisfying to bring back to life.